Those who voted no in the House-approved 2026 national budget agree the general appropriations bill passed in third and final reading last Monday reeks of corruption and kickbacks. Our next guest cites Region 4A as an example, as it is set to corner 10% of DPWH's entire 2026 budget.
That many of us here want to end kickbacks in DPWH, but assume this is impossible. I am making this manifestation in hopes that we can chip away at the perception of impossibility. Maaari nating wakasan ang kickbacks sa ilang distrito ng DPWH at balang araw sa buong DPWH.
With us now for more is Batangas 1st District Congressman Leandro Leviste. It's good seeing you again, Kong Lian.
Good to see you again,
Welcome
Kathy.
to the program. So what was it like, the first deliberations you've had as a policymaker, deliberating on the general appropriations bill?
First, there have been lots of improvements in this year's budget compared to the last one, but I still think we haven't gone far enough because the remaining DPWH budget of 624 billion pesos still has the same prices that there were before these investigations happened. We found in the investigations that less than 50% of the contract prices of projects actually go into the projects. And so I was arguing that we should lower the prices of the projects, but there seemed to be resistance on lowering the prices of DPWH projects.
You mentioned a lot of improvements, but still a ways to go. In terms of what? Because when we talk about public governance, they're still complaining we weren't really given resource person status.
Yes,
It was mere observer status for civil society.
There were 255 billion pesos of flood control projects that were reallocated to, as you said a while ago, education, health, agriculture. But even some of those things they were reallocated to, like farm-to-market roads, are also prone to corruption. And I think that a good step forward would be just to lower government spending, because no matter what you reallocate the flood control funds to, the public will think that there is still corruption. If we lower spending, then we can lower taxes, then people can decide what to spend their money on.
Why do you think you were not heard? I mean, last week you were already fighting for the lowering by 25% of the DPWH budget. And then you said the very same thing in that message that you delivered after your no vote.
Because the government will want to spend as much as the fiscal space will allow. And that's why I think the only real way that we can stop corruption in some respects in this country is to lower taxes so there is less to spend and then less to steal. As long as we have, let's say, 4 trillion pesos in tax revenues and the capacity to borrow 2 trillion pesos, then the government will propose a 6 trillion peso budget. It will not have a voluntarily lower spending and leave money on the table. The tendency would be to maximize the fiscal space, and so we should reduce the fiscal space by lowering taxes.
To what would you attribute that? Do you think it's, I mean, it is logical, but in terms of political will, are you feeling that there is maybe a group that want to believe what you do but cannot? What's the feeling that you're getting?
Okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying it's not any individual, but a whole system where the incentive of a politician is to use government funds for their own benefit, even if it's just the allocation in a way that perpetuates their hold over their district. For example, ayuda is very common in the Philippines now. We are collecting hundreds of billions of pesos of taxes so that we can then redistribute those in the form of aid to selected beneficiaries, which is what politicians use to win their re-election. And it's not any one individual's fault, but if you leave it to politicians to decide what our economic policy is, they're going to say, we should keep taxing people so that we can redistribute the proceeds back to them.
You've cited Region 4A as an example of inequality because it makes up 15% of the population and GDP and is given 10% of the whole DPWH budget.
Yeah, so speaking of the DPWH budget, people assume that there are engineers that are planning what projects to do and where to put them, when in fact, it's in large part politicians lobbying, along with even contractors lobbying for the inclusion of certain projects. The result of which is that a populous region, for example, like 4A, is getting less than its share of the country's population and GDP in terms of the DPWH budget, because what happened in the 2025 budget is that there were lots of contractors who lobbied to put huge flood control projects in some less populous island provinces. We need projects everywhere, but even these provinces that got these very big projects didn't really benefit from the billions that were invested in these projects, because there's also a temptation for the DPWH to plan projects not based on the need, but based on what is the most prone to corruption. For example, that was the story behind flood control. It's hard to audit whether the sheet piles are substandard because they're buried. And so that was the in thing for the past few budgets. Now we've increased the budget for asphalt overlays, because when they measure the thickness of the asphalt overlays, you can't immediately find out that the contractor actually cheated on the work. And if it is improperly done, then the consequences are actually less than flood control projects, which is why supposedly the kickbacks on asphalt overlay are as high as flood control. My point being that it's still business as usual in the DPWH. There are still kickbacks in the 2026 budget. There are many people in Congress who want to stop this, but I think because it's a systemic problem, then it is beyond the control of one individual member. But I hope that because the public is increasingly outraged by the continued corruption in the DPWH, then we will, as we already reduce the corruption by removing the flood control projects of 2026, hopefully also reduce the prices on the remaining projects in the DPWH budget so that we can further reduce the corruption.
What kind of support do you think you'll get from the Senate as deliberations are now at the Senate level?
I believe there has already been public statements by many senators saying that there should be an across-the-board decrease in DPWH project prices. These were points actually raised in previous committee hearings before the deliberations in the plenary of Congress's proposed national budget. And I believe that the public is playing an important role in creating political will to really reform the DPWH. We've come a long way since August, and the president's making this the top of the agenda has literally saved the country hundreds of billions of pesos from what would have been worse corruption. But I think there's still a few hundreds of billions of pesos more that we can save in the proposed 6.7 trillion national budget.
So how's your mom in on all this? Senator Loren de Garda is one of the 24 who will now deliberate on the GAB that you said no to.
She is much in favor of lowering the prices of DPWH projects.
Well, going into the budget deliberations and barely just about a month into public office, you reported a bribery attempt from a former DPWH official, and you've also filed a case against a sought-to plead, the construction company involved. What's the status of these cases now?
It's with the DOJ, and I believe the justice system right now is dealing with lots of pending cases on the DPWH. I do hope, though, that because there was overwhelming evidence with the cash and the receipt for the cash red-handed with the district engineer that offered it to me, then this could be one of the first examples of a conviction under the current investigations on DPWH projects. But that, I want to emphasize that it is systemic and happens all over the country. That's why they call it Standard Operating Procedure, or SOP. And that's why I'm saying that it's going to be unlikely that the government will be able to run after a large percent of the money that has been stolen in the past budgets, and why I hope that the public could be more galvanized to preventing corruption in the 2026 and onwards budgets.
But what about the VAT that you proposed, the VAT rate reduction from 12% to 10%? Because that didn't really galvanize the public. It actually harnessed mixed reactions. I've had two guests on the show to tell me if there are different opinions. Let's listen in to what they had to say.
Abolishing VAT is also not is also reckless, but reducing the rate from 12 to 10, honestly, Kathy, I think the DOF should study it. Lower VAT will not crash the economy if it's done wisely.
No. I think those are exactly the wrong things to do, because those provide the resources that our country can use and put to good use. It's really in the corruption that we need to address the corruption.
So what do you make of those opinions?
Very easy answer is that we should lower spending to support a lower VAT without increasing the deficit. Just yesterday, I think the DOF said that it would warn Congress against lowering the VAT because it will increase our deficit. But very simple. Our 2026 national budget is 6.7 trillion. 2025 was 6.3 trillion, meaning we are increasing spending by 400 billion pesos per year. Lowering the VAT by 2% will decrease revenues by 200 billion pesos, more or less. So if you're saying that we don't have space to lower spending by 200 billion pesos, then I would agree that we can't lower the VAT. But we just actually reduced the DPWH budget by 255 billion pesos. We could have given those proceeds back to the people in the form of a tax relief. But instead, Congress reappropriated it to mostly good uses, education, health, and agriculture, but still lots of other supposed potential, you could say, pork barrel types of programs in that. And I think that, again, ayuda, financial assistance, does good, but it would be even more efficient if instead of funding hundreds of billions of pesos a year in Dole Tupad and DSWD AIX, we instead give 200 billion pesos per year back to the people in a tax break.
A final point, less than a minute. I know that you have agreed to divest some of the shares of SBNEC. What's the status of the transfer of shares, and what do you intend to do with the proceeds?
I've already sold the majority of my shares in SBNEC to Meralco, and I have some left that I am also planning to divest so that I can focus on my job now in Congress and use the proceeds for some educational initiatives. In my province of Batangas, a lot of our public schools are underfunded, and I think that it's not the fault of any school child in Batangas that they don't have the same opportunities to excel in the workforce as people born in more privileged backgrounds. So because I was privileged in my life, I want to focus my philanthropy on helping the students of Batangas.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
insights, Kong Leandro
Thank you.
Leviste of Batangas.